Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of our Coffee Breakdown podcast. Today's guest is Professor Niek Lopes Cardozo. He's a professor at the Eindhoven University of Technology. He's been in the field for the field of fusion for over 40 years now, and he's been vice chair of the European Domestic Agency of ITER. He's also been the head of the fusion research program here in the Netherlands. And so with that, it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast, Niek.
Pleasure to be here.
So to start, I would just like to have maybe some general opinions. So your research nowadays, I read, is more into sort of like the economics of fusion, how we're going to get a working, once we have a working reactor, get it involved in producing energy for the world, and what sort of considerations are necessary to account for how to do that. And so I just like your opinions on like what you think is sort of the fusion timeline. What are the major challenges involved in getting a fusion power plant, and then maybe just what impact having fusion power would have overall. I know that's a very broad question, but I would like your opinions.
That's a lot. That's a very broad question indeed. But let's try to peel that off. First of all, I should say we don't have a demonstrated fusion power plant yet. So if you talk about timelines or projections, we can only say how fast it could possibly go if everything goes well. Of course, if there's anything that turns out to be too difficult or take much longer than we expected, it can take as long as you want, or may not even ever happen. But those are questions that is pure speculation. It's the what if kind of questions.
Okay.
But the other question you can actually analyze. You can say, once we have a working fusion power plant, or a few for that matter, so a demonstrated principle, how long will it take to roll that out and make it available to the world at a scale that is meaningful? And there again, if you think of socioeconomics or techno-economics, what a quite common approach is to estimate the probable cost of electricity or cost of investment of that fusion power plant, and then sort of work out how it works with the competition with other sources. That again is trying to predict the economic circumstances in tens of years from now. And to my opinion, as we have just been demonstrated in the past year, I would say trying to predict the economy of the world over a period longer than, let's say, half a year or so is already very tricky. And let alone 30 or 40 years from now. So I would also try to stay away from that. In fact, in my work, I stay away from that. But still, you can ask very meaningful questions. And I'll illustrate it with an example. If we want fusion to have an impact in the world, you have to think of 10,000 power plants. If the average power plant would produce a gigawatt electric or other useful power, that would add up to some tens of percent of the total energy demand of the world, and which is still increasing, so 10,000 may not even be enough. But let's say the 10,000 power plant perspective. And I'd say if today your ambition was to do only 1,000 power plants, we might as well stop. And then it's a useless exercise. So we should be aiming for 10,000 power plants. So So then the question is, if we want to have that by 2050, which would be really nice, and we don't have one yet, so let's say at the very earliest, those 10,000 could start rolling off the factory production line in 2030. That is super optimistic, of course. Then you have 20 years to build 10,000 plants. That's 500 per year. 500 power plants of a few billion euros, dollars each, corresponds to an annual investment of a few percent of the world global domestic product, the global gross domestic product. So that is a very big industry. It is also an industry that is about 100 times larger than the fission industry today. And it's much larger than fission has ever been. It would provide jobs for 100 million or a few 100 million people. So so if that is the image, you'd say, well, to have such an industry in place in 8 years from now, that is a bit of a tall order. In fact, if you look at other technologies, the typical process is that they first show an exponential growth during which the industry is built up until they reach at some point a level where they say, okay, and from here we go linear. And you see that with smartphones, you see that with the LED lighting. You saw it with the introduction of other new technologies. So, but just seeing that, okay, so we can ask the question, if fusion works, how fast could we build up that industry? And once we have that industry, how fast could we roll this out? Well, then, so you see very quickly that 2050 is too early. I mean, even if everything goes super well. But then those same arguments also hold for most of the other energy technologies that we need in the transition. The bottom line is 2050 is going to be very difficult to achieve by any standard.
I see. So
if you were to ask, how about 2070, that starts to be a much more reasonable request for the energy transition, and then fusion could play a role.
Okay. Do you think that we will make it to 2070 without any sort of reduction in, the emissions and so on and so forth, the ecological standpoint?
Of course, it's not without any reduction, but yeah, you're right. The main reductions come towards the end of the transition. No, but yeah, I mean, we have lost a lot of time. We have known that we should make that transition for, well, decades at least, and some scientists for many decades. But I think on the political agenda, climate change and the fact that we should really move to renewables and low carbon technologies has been clear for at least 20 years. And so far, nothing has happened. So yeah, you can look at the nice statistics of how solar and wind are growing, but the percentage of zero emission generation in the world energy mix is has not much grown yet.
Well, I think that also maybe you can comment on this. There's this new wave of optimism, let's say, in fusion, in terms of startups and investment in general. Do you think that is this already included in your analysis of this required exponential curve?
Yes, of course, yes. Right. Oh no, so it's very good you mentioned that, and it's also a super interesting and indeed hopeful development. Because if you take the roadmap, the government mainstream roadmap, you'd see ITER getting, well, first plasma in about 5 years or so, then taking about 10 years to reach full power performance. So the actual Q equals capital Q equals 10 power multiplication. So the specs for which it was built. Results to be, well, obtained by the end of the 2030s.
Mm-hmm.
So demo is planned to be built after that. Demo is not a power plant, but demo is a demonstrator. And if you're, well, very quick, so you finish the design, which is already on the table, of course. You finish the design shortly after you get the ITER results in. You start building early 40s, get first plasma in demo mid 50s. So then that's demo. Then you still need to move to the first generation of proper power plants.
Mm-hmm.
So then you're talking about 2070 for the first dozen or so. And of course, that is completely meaningless in terms of climate change mitigation. That doesn't mean to say that it's a waste in that case, because we are going through an energy transition. We should go through an energy transition. We should do it as fast as we can with any means we have, which probably means that by the time it's done, it's a forced transition, which you have to do with the technology that you have, and you don't have the time to develop smarter, newer technologies. So that means that probably in 2050 or 60, you still be looking at further developments and maybe even a second transition, transition 2.0, if you like. And then the new technologies such as fusion could come into play. But if you want to have it earlier, you need to go to follow the time path as are sketched by the startups indeed.
Mm-hmm.
So they typically come with I would say a demonstration power plant in the early 2030s.
So about the time that ITER should be starting up.
Yeah.
Maybe even before.
Yeah. But you should also, and this is really very fundamental. If you think that you're aiming for 10,000 power plants, the first 10 or even the first 100 don't matter so much. They're there to learn. And you should also use them to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So if you, in the government programs, there's a danger that you try to build the perfect machine the first time. And that's not going to work probably. Whereas the startups, they're not even trying to build a perfect machine. And the machines they build, in many of the cases, they explicitly say that. Take Tokamak Energy, they'll say, we'll build a new machine and we'll use it for half a year. Just to see if it works, if it does what we thought it should do, and then on to the next model. So in terms of learning, of innovation, that is a much better way. Also, then you don't have to solve all the problems in a single machine. You can take them one by one, so to speak.
Okay, and I think that sort of is a very technological approach to the problem, sort of this rapid development and prototyping is perhaps not necessarily the same as a scientific approach, which I guess is more along the lines of the ITER and European fusion roadmap, right? Do you see that these two have things to learn from each other, or are you sort of all for the technological route of just trying to
No,
build as
well,
many just burn through reactor designs until something works.
well, it's not quite like that. Of course, there's a lot of, let's say, knowledge-based design going on. So no, definitely the startups, and they're keen. They're the first to say that themselves. They build, of course, on the knowledge base and the technology base that's been created with the mainstream programs. It's a government-sponsored program. It's always going to be like that in any technology. I mean, the iPhone was also built on knowledge that was developed in universities. And then at some point, so the startups, of which there are about 40 in the world now, they typically say, well, with the present knowledge base and technology base, we think we can build a working reactor. And maybe, so this is my interpretation, but if you look at the designs, they'll say, well, maybe it's not going to work for 40 years. Maybe it's going to work for 1 year. And then we have learned so much that the next one, which we'll build in a couple of years, will be better. And that, yeah, so then you gradually take on. So the first one, to be very concrete, you'll buy the tritium.
Mm-hmm.
And you're happy if you have your tritium breeding ratio of, well, less than 1. The next one, yeah, at some point you'll need to get the tritium, but for the second one, you can probably buy the deficit of tritium. You're breeding it, but maybe not quite enough. So you still have to buy a little bit externally. And so you see those, yeah, technology readiness levels, if you like, they don't all have to be fully developed for the first power plant. If you think of life cycle, of activation of materials, of decommissioning, and so those are things you start to worry about. Yeah, once you start to build power plants in series.
I'm curious then if there are such a proliferation of startup reactor designs, and I assume they all want to try DT to produce the fusion power. Would there be a sort of like a rush in the market to pick up the tritium, right? At least currently.
That's a very good point. Maybe I can say something more generic first, and then we could come back to the tritium, and
Sure.
there may be other critical issues. So the startups, they represent, let's say, a dozen or more different concepts. And all of them could be considered as high risk in some way and high potential. So what investors do, they have a portfolio. It's very much like having a portfolio of shares, so to speak, and you have some that are very high risk and high potential, and you have some that are more, quieter in their risk profile. But this is the way to move very quickly, to manage that risk by having 10 different ones at the same time, and follow them closely, of course. It's interesting, perhaps, that to know that in fission, when fission was introduced, so you know probably that we speak of Gen 1 and Gen 2, Gen 3, and now working on Gen 4 fission. But Gen 1 fission was basically a bunch of prototypes, about 15 different ones or so. And only a handful of those made it to the series production, not even quite series, but okay, which became the Gen 2, which underwent improvements, but basically remained the same set of concepts. And it took 40 years or so before the next generation was announced, the Gen 3, which never quite took off. So most of the reactors are still Gen 2. And Gen 4, yeah, we are talking about it, we are designing it, but it's not yet on the table. So this idea of developing a lot of prototypes, different concepts at the same time, I think if you want to learn, to build in learning and innovation in a process where you're building large unit size things that take years to build, so your innovation cycle is going to be many years rather than weeks or days, like in some other businesses. The only way to do that is by building them in parallel.
Yeah. And then I guess it's also, in a way, I mean, comes to a concept that you have mentioned a lot of times. It's also a way to avoid this technological lock-in, right?
Yeah,
if you allow many startups to try many different designs, then there's sort of the expertise on how to work all those designs in the world at once, right? So that way there's sort of enough ideas to keep things fresh.
Well, so this is a very important thing you mentioned there. So we're looking at initially an exponential growth. At least we should be looking at an exponential growth to build up that industry. And during exponential growth, so you go from, let's say, from 1 to 10 to 100. And suppose your number one power plant, suppose you had only one technology selected, and your number one power plant was a tokamak. And for your second generation, now you're going to build 10, you're going to order 10, and you're not quite happy with the tokamak, and in the meantime, the stellarator looks better to you. On the basis of your one tokamak, are you going to order 10 stellarator power plants? If you haven't seen one yet, not very likely. And if you had 10, because it's exponential, it gets worse and worse. If your second generation is 10 stellarators, is your third generation going to be 100 inertial confinement plants? Not very likely, because that's just way too riskful. Yeah. So first of all, it is difficult per se in a growth scenario to avoid technology lock-in. So, so I don't think anyone has figured out how to get around that. But certainly, if you want to build in diversity, you should do that as early as possible.
Yes, so I think
later on, it's all way too expensive to change horses.
And it's funny because you mentioned fission as well, and I think that may have been what happened. Why between Gen 2 and Gen 3 there was just no, I guess, interest in some ways, because the technology it was also very costly, I guess, and so there was just more there was more risk for someone investing in a new design when the old designs worked, right? And so
well, so the crux really is that, I mean, if you're in a sort of steady state, it's fine to try out another type on the level of one, and then maybe if it's much better than the others, you're starting to gradually replace the not so good models with the better model. But during rapid growth, it means that you have your whole production set up to make model 1, and you only have a prototype of model 2. Are you going to make the jump in production capacity, so the factor 10, while also changing type? That is very unlikely.
And
at least if it's a radical innovation. I mean, if of course, if you go from red painted magnetic coils to blue painted magnetic coils, that can be done.
Right. So in that sense, you really do you see this as like a good development of all these startups
Absolutely,
coming
yes,
in?
yes.
Yeah.
I'd say because also there's much more money flowing into the system, and many more people are working in the field, and industry is getting involved. These companies think of supply chains, so it's really reorganizing the whole field. Many more engineers from other fields, very importantly. So people who have experience with other big, well, fast-moving, high-tech projects, SpaceX or things like that. So that brings a whole new energy to the fusion program. Yeah.
Much needed, I think, as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. There's urgence. There's, not sitting on problems. Just if you have two solutions for one problem, don't spend too much time on selecting which is the absolute best one. Just decide. Yeah.
And so let's switch gears a bit. I would like to switch gears a bit. And so you've brought in fission as well. And so once we move to having, let's say, a proven fusion design, it needs to enter the energy market somehow. And as far as I see it, or at least as far as being talked about, fission and fusion kind of occupy the same space in the energy market. So do you foresee them clashing, being competitors, or kind of working together? Like how do you foresee the entry into the energy market?
Yeah, so there are two concepts that are closely related that you address here. The one is, let's say, competition and market. Yeah. Let me start by saying that if there is competition, it means we're in a good place as the world. It means we can afford to say, well, we have two solutions, but we think A is nicer than B. And so the other concept was a market introduction. You have to realize that if any product, and this definitely has held for wind and solar and fission when it came into the market, they undergo a learning curve. And the learning curve says that the price drops if you, for every factor 10 that you make more of them. So if you mean to make, so in case of fusion or fission, if you plan to make 10,000 plants and your market introduction is with one plant, you still have 3 factors 10 of production capacity to go, or 4 factors 10, which means that the price is going to drop. You have to expect that. And you're competing with the things that have already gone through that price reduction. You see the same as solar. You have seen the price, the drop in price. So the upshot is that you're never going to be competitive at market introduction. Right. It's almost by definition not the case. And so there are 2 solutions to that, because you can have a policy where you say, well, but still we want to make this energy transition happen. And one is to subsidize or to give tax breaks or to have any other kind of scheme, government-sponsored scheme, to make the introduction happen. So that's happened with wind and solar and fission, for that matter. And the other 2 things can go at the same time is identifying a niche market where your particular source somehow performs or does something that all the others can't. So then that customer is going to be willing to pay maybe 5 or 10 times the price, because there's no other way to fill that gap. But the whole concept of competition, of competitively entering a market for a new technology, is, I think, it doesn't exist.
Okay, because I am familiar with the concept of like what's it called? Early adopters, I believe, that
Yeah.
there's always some percentage of the market or people involved in the market who are just sort of those risk takers. They see something new and shiny and they say, well, I'm willing to take a gamble. Right. And
Yeah.
so in that sense, there's always a starting sort of pot, but then you do have to build from there into actually breaking in, right?
Yeah, but so the people who like the shiny things when nobody else has them yet, I mean that is for CD players and things like that.
Exactly, like that's
The energy market. First of all, it gives you something you already had, so nobody's going to be impressed if you say, "I my electricity comes from a fusion power plant," because it's still just electricity. And secondly, the energy market is the largest single market in the world. It's a turnover of 10 trillion or so per year. So this is not a gadget market. So I think when you speak of the niche market where it can enter, so for solar cells, those were the satellites. So in the early 1960s, solar cells, well, they were ridiculously expensive, of course. But there was a market, there was a client who was willing to pay whatever they asked, because otherwise the satellites wouldn't work. And you have to realize that all those satellites that are circling the globe and provide our navigation networks and communication networks, they are powered by solar power. All of that would not have been possible without those very expensive early solar cells. So yeah, that's a niche market. And once you have that, you get some production going, your price goes down. And then the niche market, so a somewhat larger, somewhat less niche market can open up. So then the question becomes, is there a niche market for fusion, which is not accessible to fission? Yeah.
Do you have some ideas on things like that?
Well, of course, in their profile, fission and fusion look similar. They're point sources. They provide steady output. They don't like to be switched on and off. And as such, they are not very good for stabilizing the net, for instance. And well, fusion, so they're quite similar. But of course, fission has the drawbacks that are well known. Whether that's technically fully, let's say, deserved is not a question of, but there are the issues with waste and danger. And fusion has, so I think you can say fusion fundamentally doesn't have any possibility to have explosive mishaps or so. On the waste, okay, we can have a talk because it's also not wasteless, but let's say it's lower and not as long-lived as with fission. But on the other hand, the Gen 4 fission reactors are also aiming for much reduced waste and for increased safety, so they'll come closer together. So yeah, but I mean, there again, if fission does the same thing cheaper, sooner, it's good for mankind. And we shouldn't think of that in terms of competition.
I see. So it's sort of, it's another tool in our tool belt, let's say, to
well, we don't have so many. It's not like the box is filled with lots of options and we are embarrassed for choice. And you might say fusion, well, you can definitely say fusion is the only energy generating technology of which we know that the physics process exists and should work. It works in the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And we know pretty well how it should work in a fusion reactor, but we have never been able to realize it yet. So that alone is enough reason to make it happen. I mean, until we have seen, well, I'd say at least a handful of working fusion reactors, we're not in a position to say, well, anything about cost, desirability, or so. Let's first show it.
I see. Okay. And then in that sense, then in the process of making the fusion reactor work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's decisions that must be made on how to eventually move the design towards an economical product.
Mm-hmm.
But in that sense, from your words, do you think that now is a time where we should even be concerned about how do we make components that are mass producible or with materials that are, you know, readily available and easy to make? Are these considerations that play a role in the scientific development of the fusion reactor currently? Or do you think that's the next phase after we've already proven the fusion process can be sustained?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. I'd say if you had technological solutions that essentially hinge on materials of which you know there's too little of, yeah, unless you think, okay, we'll do this for the demonstrator and then we'll come up with a better solution, that's fine. But if you already know this can only work with this particular element and there's not enough of it, maybe not. And things like the mass production, so the developing from modular, and so that is the way to go for many reasons. And the main reason in this phase is if you want to learn, you need to shorten the innovation cycle. So with your hand designs, all components are different machines that take 10 years to put together. Yeah, you almost by definition are working with obsolete technology. So if you have coils that can be mass produced, you really want to be able to build your machine much quicker than in 10 years. If you can put a machine together in 3 years, test it, then you can learn. Then you can learn in time for the next machine. If you take 10 years to build, and in 10 years you should also be launching your next generation, the next generation is going to be exactly the same as your first generation because you didn't learn.
Right.
Yeah.
That's also interesting because, I mean, there's the sort of like the economics of scale component to it, but also the learning component, as you mentioned, right? Like, I mean, how fast, even if, is it sufficient to know it doesn't work to learn from it? Or do you also need to actually, you know, have the people there to figure out, okay, what could work instead, right? That process is not guaranteed to fit into a timeline.
No, but
right?
that's a big problem. That's well, it's also interesting that if you analyze it, you'd say there's during exponential growth, there's a time between generations when you grow by a factor of 10, say. So that is the exponential growth time. Let's say the 10-folding time. Then there's the building time. If your build time is much longer than that, you have to already order the next 100 power plants if the first 10 have not been built. That's unfortunate. So you want to have your build time in any case shorter than your 10 folding time or something like that. But if you also want to learn, you need to switch on the machine, see the results, and stick that in your next design. So now your build time should be much shorter than the generation time, because in that period, you have to evaluate the results, make decisions on the next, and then you have to build the next one. And then you go within one learning cycle. You say, okay, we have to build a machine. Well, it has all sorts of components. You're probably in parallel trying to improve all the components. And so the final learning step is when you put everything together. But how fast do you learn in each of those components? Think of the components of our regular tokamak-like fusion power plants. How quickly can you develop a much better gyrotron or a much better neutral beam injector or a much better cryopump for that matter? Those things take years to develop. And so all that learning has to be much quicker if you don't want to make the same mistakes every time. And so if you compare that to the iPhone, for instance, or the smartphone in general, the iPhone, which is nice because they're numbered, every year you have a new one.
Yeah.
But the Apple can put together, so they're trying out new cameras and new everything, but they put it together. They take 4 to 6 weeks to put a prototype together in the factory, evaluate it. So their cycle is a few weeks. And that is then well in time to decide on what the next model is going to look like, produce it in time for the customers to have it available when the new model is launched. So there you have cycle time, the innovation cycle time is short, a few weeks. The generation time is a year. The build time is, well, once it's in the factory, is weeks. So there, everything is in the right order, so to speak.
It's interesting because so then your solution to sort of get this sort of scaling factor is just shorten the amount of time it takes for one cycle.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'm curious then on the learning part of that cycle, like, because as you said, even learning how to make like a new NBI system takes years. But do you see any way to reduce that in any way? Like, it's having a lot of different examples to pull from doesn't necessarily mean that people will learn faster. At least in my head, it's hard to equate the two.
That is a fundamental problem with things that are so big. That you have your new device. Well, in a sort of mathematical description, you say, okay, first you need to evaluate. First, you're not learning. Then you're starting to learn. And then there's an end to the learn. At some point, you have learned everything you want to learn about. There's to learn from that particular device. And then you have to use all that learning to make the next generation or the next model and go through the cycle again. So your learning goes, so maybe I am indicating cost. So the cost is here, then you start to learn, your cost is going down, then that is the cost of the next thing, the next iteration, and then it stops. So it's almost like a step function. And the question is, when does that learning happen? Of course, it's spread in time, but that's mathematically you could say, okay, first you haven't learned, then you have learned. So somewhere there's time. And that moment in time, you should compare to your build time, your generation time. Yeah.
So it's not a matter of absolutes, it's just relatives, trying to get the two, like the build time and the learning time in sync with each other.
Yeah.
To get like sort of the optimal cycle.
Yeah, and
I
it
see.
also has to do with the exponential growth time. So this is particularly difficult while you're growing very fast, because then the risk of trying out something new is multiplied by 10 every time because you're growing. So what you typically see in radical innovation. Now maybe I'm going way out of my field of expertise, but you saw the PC develop. So it became faster and faster and better and better. And at some point it was kind of fast enough. So then design started to be much more important. You get fancy models. Everybody could make those things. So a lot of different brands.
Mm-hmm.
But that as a computer, that kind of leveled off. And only then was there space for a radical innovation, such as the iPad and the iPhone. You wouldn't have developed the iPad together with the PC.
So there needs to be, at least, if I understand this correctly, some kind of working foundational model, and then you can build on top of it.
Yeah, so during the time you're growing really fast, and it is super, disruptive. If at the same time you think, maybe this is not the best we can do, let's try something else.
Mm-hmm.
Once you are in a steady state, your sales are going well. That is a very good moment to say, but we also have another product that we can build on this, and you just open up a new market.
But then doesn't this kind of go against the fact of parallelizing the development across many designs?
And no, I would say, so there are two moments in that development where you can parallelize or have radical innovation. At the very beginning, because then it's still cheap. Well, it's not cheap in absolute terms, of course, but it's much cheaper than when you try to do it later. You can have a lot of parallel developments. Then you have to sort of down select because it's too expensive to keep trying them all. And so you end up with a handful, just like in fission, concepts that work. And well, that is a good situation if you have a handful of concepts that work. You start building them, and you start maybe build hundreds of them. And you're still learning. So it's still quite possible that by that time you have a new idea that's even better, that promises to be even better. Yeah, but those have already gone through the price reduction and the series productions, and so the new idea, I think, can only blossom once this market has kind of settled a little bit.
I see. So in sort of like this tenfolding time, or this tenfolding process, you don't need to say all of the 10 new reactors have to be the same design. You can maybe do 5 with the same, and then the other 5 you can pick some other ones, right?
Yeah.
And so in that way, you're simultaneously taking advantage of the expertise you have built from the original prototype, but not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? So is this sort of like the ideal approach then?
Yeah, well, we're trying to figure that out, if there's a mathematically defined ideal approach. It's like a game theory. It's a lot like evolution in a way. So this whole process where you say you need some time to generate a lot of new ideas, and you need time to down select. And so there are 2 timescales in this process. So and like in evolution, if you have something that has new generations every few days, like the Drosophila, the fruit fly, then it's the evolution is the pace of evolution is not generation limited. I'd say it's limited by how quickly you generate new mutations. On the other hand, if you have a very long generation time, you'll have plenty of mutations in the DNA. Yeah, but it takes ages before you can down select them. So then the pace of evolution is a generation time limited. And it's the same for technology, I should think.
I see. So that then it still lends well to the argument that we should reduce the generation time as much as possible, that we have more chances for beneficial mutations, right?
Well, reducing the generation time. Well, the generation time in our case during exponential growth would be the time for tenfolding, for instance. And if that's 10 years, that's doubling every 3 years. That's okay-ish. Faster would be nice, but this is already really super fast.
Okay.
But if you have 10 years to develop to learn from the previous generation, maybe do a few quick prototypes and get ready to build your new generation based on your new principles, your new learning in time to deliver them, to have them operational after 10 years, that's a stretch.
I see.
I think for fusion reactors or fission reactors for that matter, you see that the second generation, which worked like that in fission, it started in 2017 or so, and basically lasted now, let's say 40 years, 30 years. Yeah.
And that's too slow in your.
Well, they down selected from a large number of prototypes, and they were lucky enough to have at least a handful of concepts that worked, some better than others, but yes, we don't have the prototypes yet. So we don't know that we are going to end up with a handful of working concepts. Yeah, but I mean, if you ask me what is the best fusion can hope for, it is that, a handful, half a dozen of the startups are successful in making a prototype. Very different technologies. I mean, it could be the general fusion with the liquid lead wall, or it could be the Commonwealth fusion systems with super high fields, or it could be the first light with the smart inertial fusion concept, or it could be any of the magnetized target fusion concepts. I don't care.
Okay.
All of them that are, let's say, not physically forbidden. So I think there are also some concepts around of which you can show that it cannot possibly work.
Right.
But there are certainly also quite a few of those companies that are very serious, have super bright teams. Let's just hope that they produce concepts that work.
Okay. I could ask a silly question now, but if you were a gambling person, which one would you put your money on?
Well, this comes back to what I said in the beginning. I think what the investors do is spread the risk. Maybe, yeah. So within the fusion community, if you like, the whole concept of risk isn't discussed very often. We are all in the game of hoping the risk will be small.
I see.
That everything will go all right. But if you're an investor, and also if you're in a startup company, it's all about the risk versus potential. And so what you see, I don't know if you have ever looked into this, but these startups, they go through rounds of investments. And the first round, they typically get, let's say, 1 million or so, and then maybe tens of millions, and then maybe hundreds of millions. But there are different investors.
Mm-hmm.
So someone with an idea, there may be an angel who takes a fancy, provide 100,000 euros, so a few people can work for a year on working out the idea. That is de-risking the idea. First, it was only a sketch on paper, then some serious work has been done. So either it's still good, in which case the risk has been reduced, or it can go out of the window and the 100,000 euros are gone. But if it's still good, this company may become interesting to people who are willing to put in 1 million because the risk has been reduced. That for the initial investor, that means that the company that was worth $100,000 now is worth 1 million. So he can cash in and use the money for, but because this person probably had 10 different projects like that, of which only one was successful. So at the lower level, the risk can be high and you can spread the money because it's not so much money, and it can work like that. If you go one tier higher, there's more money involved, but the risk has been reduced. Yeah. So I don't think you should think of this as gambling persons. It's managing a risk portfolio.
And that is true. I mean, even as a fusion community, that's why we sort of support these startups to give it their best shot, because in a way, they are also supporting us in a way by propagating the field. If any of those ideas work, then we're all still in business basically. So that's that's true. It's a good point that it should not be seen as very all or nothing kind of mentality. You should not look at it with an all or nothing mentality. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to then maybe round off with some other things, because you brought up this topic of niche markets. So it's also a question I've been meaning to ask you. Are there other uses for fusion energy that is just not electricity generation? I think we've talked about this before. We kind of are very narrow-minded in saying fusion to produce electricity, but there may be other uses. And so I was curious if you've given some thought or explored that at all.
Yes, well, first of all, yes, we have worked on that quite a bit. And actually, we have a student who's graduating next week, as it is, as we are speaking, Mustastan Majid, on exactly this topic. But first of all, let me say this. A fusion power plant, if you make electricity with it, is a terribly inefficient electricity producer because it uses so much electricity itself. So the overall plant efficiency could be 20% or so. It could also be less, but 20% would be a success. Which means that 80% is heat. Well, so you think, okay, can't we just sell the heat instead of the electricity? And now, if you think of the electricity market, you'll see that quite likely, if all goes well, the renewables, wind and solar, are taking off, and their electricity is really cheap.
Because it's sort of direct conversion.
And they're not making a lot of heat. So unless they are not providing an electricity for which you need a solution, that solution is not likely to be fusion. It needs to be something else. So you're looking at a market for electricity of which the price is coming down. There's plenty of electricity, just not so much use for it. Because at the moment, electricity is only 20% of the energy market. And we're electrifying all sorts of processes, but we're not going to use electricity for everything. So on the other hand, we use heat a lot. So 80%, well, okay, there are also intermediate cases where you use the fuel, but in the heat as used in industry today is made with fossil fuel, which we have to phase out. And certainly high temperature heat, let's say the iron melts and things, is very difficult to make without a gas that you can burn, or, well, with electricity you can make a plasma, but still not super efficient. So what we'll see, is my take, is that the price of electricity is coming down and the price of heat is going up. So now you have this source that is a very strong source of high temperature heat, medium temperature heat, 500 C or so, very much wanted by industry. And your idea is that you're going to use 20% of that, to turn that with a 20% efficiency into electricity, which you want to sell in a market where most of the time the electricity costs nothing. So, or even negative. So you'd be, either you have to switch off your machine or you have to pay to get rid of your electricity. So I think that is a no-go, really. Whereas the alternative, so then you start to think about what can we do with the heat. Incidentally, there are recent reports also from the fission community who have exactly the same problem, although they are slightly better at making electricity. You also have to realize that if you make 80% heat and you don't use it, you have to dump it somehow. And that is going to cost money, because that is an awful lot of heat to dump in surface waters. And maybe that brings me to generalize this concept, rather than thinking we have a standalone reactor and it makes a commodity such as electricity, which we stick in a network and then we hope that someone will buy it. We need to optimize the system. So then you're looking at combinations of sources or combinations of customers and producers that together are in a symbiosis, much cleaner and much cheaper and better than when you have them separate in a mismatched system. Heat, of course, unlike electricity, you don't want to transport heat over long distances. And there, the fact that fusion is really safe gives it an edge here over competitors, if you like, because you could really place it right close to your customer, and even close to urban areas. So the waste heat could still be used to do district heating. Yeah, so I think we should start to think about the energy system in such kinds of ways, where you make optimum use of the energy. Energy is going to be a scarce good.
So, and that's it, right? Because I think even electricity itself, in terms of global energy usage, is only 20%-ish.
Yeah.
The rest of it is mostly just processing heat and stuff like this. So it's actually very limiting in a way to say we're only going to produce electricity. Yeah, sure. And I'd say you asked about market entry and competition. And I already said, well, forget about those concepts, because at market introduction, you're never going to be competitive. But you have to look for a niche market, perhaps. But so if you are thinking of selling electricity with fusion, so then you're selling something that everybody already has. And you're really looking at competition. I mean, I think that's an absolute no-go. All right. And
not going to happen.
So thank you, Niek, for these wonderful insights. I think we're rounding up on our time now. So yeah, it's been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot more about how we should approach fusion as a technology in general. And I would like to leave the final words to you. Do you have some words to say to anybody who might be interested in fusion?
Well, I was in a sort of school for people from industry who are interested in fusion 2 weeks ago in Oxford. And it was interesting because they had lessons, they had lectures from people from the mainstream fusion system, and they were all about how difficult it is. And yeah, it was quite deep into the technologies, and which is understandable. And then there was a forum discussion with 4 directors of startups, serious bigger startups. And one of them, the director or CEO or whatever, of First Light, I think it was, said, fusion is such a wonderful field to be active in because there's a problem and there's so many solutions for it. and that really changed the atmosphere, the energy in the room, I thought. Because in the fusion system we are kind of stuck in there's only one way to do it and there are so many problems. And this was completely the reverse. It was like, there's so many ways to do it. And yeah, they all have their issues, but you do have to realize that some of the issues that like, let's say the roadmap solutions that the ITER demo solutions have, where you think, okay, but the startups will have those problems too when they get to that point. But sometimes they don't, because they have radically different solutions. They may not have a first wall, or tritium breeding may not be their problem, or yeah.
But it's a complete shift in mentality almost, to focusing on the problems and how hard they are, to focusing on the potential and exactly how much there is to learn and do, the challenges, let's say. Yeah. So thank you very much, Niek, for coming onto the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me, and enjoy the day.
And to all the listeners, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.